Biotech IPOs that do go out remain hot, but will that continue into the fall? Impact of the Biosecure Act is starting to come into focus, and WuXi AppTec is once again in the crosshairs of the US government. We'll discuss both on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. We'll also take a look at how the political calendar will shape biopharma's future and what's in the clinic for cancer-associated cachexia. But first, BioCentury is expanding its horizon scanning tools, data, and analysis to help drug hunters track where translational science is heading next. Here to tell you about that is our editor-in-chief, Simone Fishburne, and our colleague, Karen Tkach-Tusman, Director of Biopharma Intelligence. So what's new, Simone? Karen?
Well, what's new is really just an expansion of what we've done. And so what we really lean into at BioCentury is horizon scanning. We now have, as you've been hearing, not one, but two Grand Rounds conferences each year, which is, our horizon scanning, very forward-looking, what's the next science and solving scientific problems conferences. But the distillery, or the innovation distillery, is a product we've had for a while, and we've now just expanded this in several dimensions and ways. So one is there's just many more items, 200 plus a month that we're putting in there. The other is the scope of items. Now, what is the distillery? Karen will explain a little more, but briefly, it is a tool that lets you find innovations from the academic literature that let you find items with translational potential that you might want to license or partner or just know about for competitive intelligence. So it's pretty exciting, and it's a handy new interface that we've got.
So yeah, this is a really exciting time for the Innovation Distillery. It's come a long way since the PDF-based products of 2008 when we launched it. Now it is a database that's part of a module within BCIQ that is focused on the scientific papers coming out of the literature that highlight a really wide spectrum of innovations, not just targets and compounds, but actually going beyond that to things like enabling tools and technology, both wet lab and computational, to modality design and optimization approaches, things around, say, manufacturing or the little tweaks that make cell therapies better, and emerging disease biology that is not just when a paper has arrived at a neat conclusion around a specific target, but the disease atlases. We've highlighted some of these in analyses where they kind of capture more. Here's broad look at patient samples to understand the heterogeneity and mechanisms of disease, biomarkers, and you'll see some analyses from our colleague Danielle highlighting that in Alzheimer's. Basically, what we do is, we've always considered the spectrum of translational research to be wider than just here's a target and here's a compound. But now we're really bringing that to the fore in a findable, filterable, searchable way within our innovation distillery.
Awesome, KTT. Where can our subscribers find this new hub for the distillery?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, it's part of our BCIQ database. So within the BCIQ tab, you can find it, and we'll put a link directly in the show notes.
Awesome. Thanks, KTT and Simone. Let's head over to the public markets. While the IPO spotlight last week was on SpaceX, investors were still pouring plenty of cash into biotech, including the largest IPO in the sector's history. Stephen Hansen, our lead finance writer and man in the UK, is here to talk about it. Stephen, how's the market for biotech IPOs?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's as I mentioned, I think for the ones that are choosing to go out, it's been good. We've seen some good pricing. We've seen some good upsizing for deals, some pretty good aftermarket performance. So a few stats so far this year. Just looking at IPOs that have priced on U.S. exchanges, we've had 12 so far. 8 of them are still trading either at or above their IPO price. So, 2/3 performing well, which is a good sign. 6 of the 7 that have gone out this quarter are also trading at or above their IPO price. So it's gotten even better as we've gotten through the second quarter here. And as you mentioned, we've had two 700 million plus IPOs. So IPOs have raised more than $700 million. Parabolis, 770 million last week. And then Kylera raised 719 million earlier this quarter. So, it feels like there's plenty of demand out there, kind of despite the geopolitical backdrop that was playing. And then obviously lots of people focus on the US, but, just taking a quick look at Hong Kong, we've also had 4 IPOs get done there as well. Also doing quite well. All of them are up, ranging anywhere from 25 to nearly 250%. So I know there's a big queue of Hong Kong IPOs out there, but we've not had as many gotten done yet. But the ones that have gotten out do seem to be performing pretty well.
Hey, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, the last week's one was Parabolis, of course. That is led by CEO and Chairman Matai Mammon. Previously was head of R&D at J&J, in fact. And before that, in fact, he was one of the drivers of Theravant. So he's getting himself a track record there. And, that technology came from Greg Verdeen. And they actually had some very good clinical data last year. And Kylera also had clinical data. And where I'm going with this, because I know that Parabolis raised, what they raised, and there was an over-allotment as well, actually, which I think you guys think is going to get probably satisfied.
Yep.
A large amount of money. They also had, and you'll remind me the amount, concurrent investment by Regeneron, right?
75 million, I think, concurrent investment. Yep.
So they're sort of like knocking at the, 800 million maybe out of that raise.
If you want to add that on, more than that, yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. Because what I'm getting at with them and Kylera, whatever, they are, raising money. Do you think this money should take them now to product to market? Is this money going to, so it's almost like a kind of old fashioned model, say, where you have a technology, you raise enough to get you the data that will allow you to proof of principle, bring in investors to then get your product to market with the next raise. How about that for a model? Is that what you're looking at?
It could be. I mean, in these two specific instances, I don't. I'm afraid you're catching me out. I don't know exactly what they've guided for in terms of this cash, but I think you're right in the sense that this will definitely get them through the late stage, I would think, and into sort of that pre-commercialization activity, and then. But you're right. This is a lot of money that's meant to be able to push these programs far and have these companies operate independently and be able to commercialize independently. I think that's definitely part of the strategy here. The other thing I wanted to touch on, though, is, I was wondering how the Parabolis deal was going to happen, given the fact that it was going out the same week as SpaceX. That was one of, I think, the big questions was when you have these mega IPOs, how much of the air or of the liquidity do they suck out of the market? And will there be, will people be basically saving money? Will they not want to go in on the Parabolis deal because they're, wanting to save some of their capital to invest in SpaceX? And I think, what we saw with Parabolis, I think that suggests that's not the case. Obviously, we'll have 2 more mega IPOs probably coming later this year, and Anthropic and OpenAI. So that's, I think, going to be an open-ended question when we start talking about IPOs in the fall. But I think that's something that we'll be looking at. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I think that's also something to think about for stuff coming this fall, because it seems like it's a great setup, I think, going into the rest of the year where things stand now. But I think we need to obviously be watching what the Fed does, right? Because the European Central Bank, just last week, they raised interest rates for the first time in 3 years. Mainly that was, determined by rising inflation. That was attributed to the conflict in the Middle East. So there's a Fed meeting this week. So, President Trump finally has his own chair at the Fed in Kevin Warsh. So what does he do? Does he hold firm? Does he raise rates? It's a lot of moving parts here, obviously, with the supposed agreement over the weekend. So I think that's going to play
one thing I can
part.
Guarantee you, Stephen, is that you and even Biotech are not the only people watching what Walsh does at the Fed.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Yeah. But it's, we have a biotech IPO that's expected to go out this week, right? So Cardigan, a cardiac company, is looking to target 350 million at the midpoint. They're expected to price this week. So, I think that'll also be a good sort of test to see how the markets, are digesting sort of biotech IPOs post SpaceX and most likely post, a Fed decision on rates. Yeah, we'll be keeping our eyes on it for sure.
And that over allotment by Brablis did get exercise, underwriters taking advantage of the old green shoe, and so that brought the IPO to just north of 770 in millions. That's the new bar. All right, Stephen, thanks for that. Okay, so the Biosecure Act, it's starting to come into focus. The act, which President Trump signed into law in December, prohibits the federal government from procuring, obtaining biotech equipment, services from a biotech company of concern. And now the US government has branded WuXi AppTec a Chinese military company. Steve, what's the significance of that?
So just a little bit to add on to what you said about Biosecure, it's not only that it prevents the US government from procuring services or goods from biotechnology companies of concern, but it prohibits the government from contracting with companies for products that depend on products or services from a biotechnology company of concern. That's a little bit convoluted, but it's really important because when you look at WuXi, WuXi isn't likely to be providing much services to the US government, but it provides services to companies that do, right? So here's the news. The Department of Defense added WuXi AppTec to a list of Chinese military companies, the so-called 1260H list. That means it will automatically be designated as a biotechnology company of concern under the Biosecure Act if the 1260H listing endures. So, WuXi AppTec filed a lawsuit in federal court contesting its listing as a Chinese military company. To me, two things were really interesting about the suit. The most important is that it may bring into light the evidence, its assertion, which the Department of Defense has now made and which members of Congress have been making for some time, that WuXi AppTec has close ties to the Chinese government, that it works closely with the Chinese military, and so on. WuXi absolutely denies it. It says it's a public company, its leadership team are U.S. citizens, it doesn't work for the Chinese military, has been alleged. Hopefully, the courts are going to do what they're supposed to do, which is render an impartial opinion and let the public see the evidence. The other thing that I found really interesting is the harms associated with being included on the 1260H list. They go beyond bans on defense contracting and on Biosecure, which I'd known about. They go down to the state level in the United States. So, for example, the complaint that WuXi AppTec filed says that the state of Utah bars companies that are on the 1260H list from purchasing real estate in the state. Texas says that retirement plans can't invest in the stock of companies that are listed on the 1260H list, and they have to disinvest when a new company is added. And, of course, there's the bigger picture, which WuXi AppTec talked about, which is Biosecure and the kind of reputational damage that being characterized as a Chinese military company has in the United States, which is likely to lead at least some customers to make plans to find other companies to provide services.
Thanks for that, Steve. How does this fit into the bigger picture of how government officials in the U.S. are thinking about China?
So the WuXi news, it's really the latest in an ongoing and really vigorous debate that's happening largely behind the scenes in Washington, though it pops into view every now and then. There are some influential voices who contend that biopharma is just like rare earths, and they use that analogy explicitly, and that the U.S. has to do everything that it can to avoid dependence on China, or biopharma products will become a chokehold, just like rare earths have. This argument resonates with the national security community and on Capitol Hill. There's another group that says, no, really, life sciences are quite different from rare earths, and while supply chain resilience is a clear national security priority, it's really important to take care to understand the biopharma industry and to avoid policies that will hurt patients in the U.S. and U.S. companies, and not to just reach for the same kind of playbook that's being used or considered for rare earths and maybe for semiconductors and for other technologies.
Thanks for that, Steve. Stick around. We'll get back to you in a little bit to talk about some of that inside the Beltway gossip about what's happening in government. But first, we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back to talk about what's in the clinic for Cachexia.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the second BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th. The second edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe convenes the leaders shaping the future of biopharma. This time we meet in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th, gathering academic innovators, biotech CEOs, pharma R&D leaders and investors to debate the translational science that will define the next decade. GramRounds Europe focuses on what matters most: breakthrough biology, transformative technologies, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. GramRounds is where rigorous science meets real-world execution. Join Biosecure and regional host chairs Forbion and BGV and take a deep dive on translational opportunities in the Benelux region. Biosecure GramRounds Europe, where discovery moves toward impact. Register at biocenturygramrounds.com.
All right, we're back on the Biosecure This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at Biosecure and host of the podcast, and I'm pleased to have my colleague Tierney Baum join us. Tierney, you've been speaking with Catalum, led by CEO Scott Clark. They're working on Cachexia. I know Pfizer's a leading company in the space as well. What did you learn as you dug into this?
Yeah, so, just to give a little bit of background on the indication for those who aren't as familiar, cachexia is a muscle wasting disorder that's most frequently associated with cancer. So it can be associated with other severe diseases, but it's particularly insidious with cancer because it forms this nasty positive feedback loop where you have severe muscle wasting in advanced cancer patients. They can't be treated with as much cancer therapy, so the tumor progresses because they can't handle it, and then their cachexia gets worse, and on and on and on. About 70% of hard-to-treat cancers also have cachexia, and it's been really hard to develop therapies for and not fully understood mechanisms. So there's been a target that's emerged kind of amazingly that you can target both, and that's GDF15, which is a cytokine. There's been some cool clinical data coming out, as you mentioned, from Pfizer and Catalum that are pretty neck and neck in the clinic, both looking at this target inhibiting GDF15 as a target that can both address cachexia symptoms and also tumor symptoms.
So, Tierney, this has obviously been a really difficult area for a long time. I always find it interesting when then two come along at the same time. And, are there any specific sort of breakthroughs or reasons why this is happening now? GDF15 is, of course, not a newly discovered cytokine or molecule, right? So is it just sort of greater understanding of the biology around it? Because at the end of the day, you have this, as we talk about a lot in cancer, and now we're talking about it in cachexia, we have this sort of overlap with immune evasion mechanisms. So talk a little bit mechanistically, geek us out on that, Tierney.
Yeah, so you're correct. The GDF15 was discovered about 30 years ago, and it's kind of an interesting story where it was initially researched in fetal maternal immune tolerance. So women that had high GDF15 levels were more likely to make it to term. And we've not fully understood the mechanism, but we're beginning to understand that basically tumors can co-opt this to evade the immune system themselves. I think the turning point was that just before 2020, they discovered the receptor that exists in brainstem neurons. So that's GFRAL. And that actually, I think, pushed the field forward a little bit in understanding where in the central nervous system GDF15 is binding. And we started to understand that by binding in the CNS and brainstem neurons, that's where a lot of appetite suppression was being controlled, nausea, and this metabolic shift that happens in cachexia. Because cachexia is really a syndrome. It cannot be corrected with diet or simply eating more. So there's a much deeper metabolic mechanism going on. And I think understanding its receptor in the CNS made it so that we could target it in the clinic.
And then one more question, Tierney. Here what we're talking about is a sort of a wasting disease. And I know that a lot of the readouts aren't, it's not just sort of eat more, right? A lot of the readouts are actually weight gain. And I am wondering whether there is any synergy or interaction or learning that have come from the other side of the coin, all the work in obesity. So is there sort of, from a nutrition angle or from a metabolic angle, any overlaps between these fields?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit nascent to say, but when anybody loses a lot of weight, they also lose muscle. And so, of course, in the area of GLP-1s, we see people losing a lot of weight, and they're also at risk of losing muscle mass. And so I think it is possible that some cachectic drugs in the future, if not repurposed themselves, could be used to learn more about how to avoid muscle wasting in obesity or type 2 diabetes.
Tierney, tell us a little bit about the leading drugs in the clinic.
Yeah, so Pfizer and Catalem both have anti-GDF-15s in the clinic, and they both really had phase 2 successes last year. What's interesting is that strategically, they're kind of taking two different routes potentially to the same end, which is Pfizer has focused much more on the cachexia side of things in their phase 2. And in their phase 2, which was in advanced solid tumors, they showed significant weight gain, and they are now in phase 3 for cachexia. Catalem, on the other hand, they are definitely looking at cachexia, but they're also looking at tumor regression. So they had some positive results in their phase 2. And what's really interesting about theirs is that they were doing it in combination with PD-1 inhibitors, so checkpoint inhibitors, and they were found that they recruited a highly refractive PD-1 population, and they were able to resensitize part of this population to this. That's a really interesting potential for that drug, and both of these drugs have now entered phase 3 in the last 6 months.
Thanks for that, Tierney. I will drop a link in the show notes to your story. Definitely a space that we'll continue to follow as these products move hopefully closer to the market. All right, Steve, thanks for sticking around. What's the scuttlebutt in Washington these days?
There's nothing but scuttlebutt in Washington. I think that one of the more interesting dramas that's happening in Washington is a lot of the rumors around the fate of HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy. I wrote a story last Thursday where I predicted that he's likely to be ousted, but probably not until after the midterm elections. And I went through some of my logic as to why I think he's likely to stay on that far, basically because the Trump administration wants to keep the goodwill of the MAHA voters in the midterm elections. Predictions are perilous. Over the weekend, there was a lot of gossip going around in Washington about Kennedy's future. I think it traces back to a tweet that Robert Malone, who's an anti-vaccine activist who was close to Kennedy and was Kennedy put him on the advisory committee on immunization practices. Malone tweeted that Kennedy was going to be resigning or forced to resign as early as July 4th. HHS immediately hopped onto X and refuted that and said that it isn't true. So who knows? I think it is pretty clear, the consensus among people who are speaking with the White House and people speaking with HHS and watching what's going on. It's pretty clear that Kennedy's days are numbered, but I still think it's more likely than not that he's going to last until November. The other thing that people are pointing out is that effectively he's kind of checked out from most of the day-to-day operations at HHS. The day-to-day operations at the department are being handled by Chris Klomp, who's also the deputy director of the Center for Medicare and deputy CMS administrator. And the view right now is that what's most likely to happen is that Kennedy will be pushed out or will walk out sometime after the midterm elections. The strongest candidate for taking over at HHS right now seems to be Mehmet Oz, the head of CMS. And then the betting is that Chris Klomp would take his role at CMS. You know, these things are all subject to change. We're in a very turbulent situation, and I have to say that the whole year has been full of surprises. So we'll just have to, keep popcorn handy and see what happens.
Excellent, Steve. Well, hope you got a lot of popcorn. All right. Tierney, Simone, Stephen, KTT, Steve, thanks for joining this week. Cole Travis is our production engineer. Always appreciate his good work. And we also are grateful to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing music for our podcasts. If you're a BioCentury subscriber, tune in later this week. We'll have another edition of BioCentury's Front Row series with our colleague Lauren Martz joining Larry Campbell. Until next week, thanks for listening.